Hello and welcome to the week 3 lecture for CIS133P. So this week we are going to talk about displaying data, and we're also going to talk about repetition, and you'll see they fit together pretty well. So, sorry, my computer's being a little laggy. Like I said, we're going to talk about a couple different forms of repetition. While and for are the ones that I'm going to use the most. There's also a do format. And we're going to talk about how to format data as a table. Now, you may never have worked with tables before. Tables kind of have a negative reputation in the world of HTML, but when it comes to dynamic information like what we're doing, they make a lot more sense. So one thing that I want to talk about just briefly is your reading assignment for this week and how it fits into the big picture. Your reading goes down some different avenues than we're going to get to for a long time, so I'm just pointing that out. So your book's going to talk about the difference between get and post, which we've already discussed, processing form data, and generating HTML based on that data. Classic example with that would be like there's a form, you enter your name, and it says, "Hello, Ken." Or like this week, I'm going to have you enter dimensions, and you're going to draw a checkerboard, right? So generating HTML from the data that you get from a form. Your book is going to get into emailing data. So the reason I'm talking about this is that is a cool thing, and it's probably something that you're interested in learning about. But I'm not going to talk about that for a while. It's going to be quite a while before we talk about email. It usually ends up being in a completely different course. So know that you're going to read about email, and it's going to look like a pretty easy thing to do. It's literally just an email function. But I just want you to understand that it is not going to work on XAMPP. You have to do some pretty heavy configuration to XAMPP to make it be able to email stuff. Long story short, in order to send email, you need an email server, and you don't have one set up. You can link it to like your Gmail or wherever your email's at, right? Your college account. I don't know what you use for your email, but you have to get that configured. So you're going to read about it, but you're not going to do anything with it. Next week, we're going to start actually storing data in a database. Now, the reason your book goes into emailing data is because when you collect information from a user, oftentimes you want to do more than just generate some HTML. Oftentimes you want to store it permanently or use it for something long term. And emailing is a good way to kind of fake that because you can do something more than just draw it straight on the screen. So it's useful, but we're not going to talk about it, and that's okay. We're getting very close to the database part of things, which is where it starts to get interesting. Alright, so the first thing we're going to talk about is a while loop. You should be familiar with these in some format. I'm sure you've seen something like a while loop before in some language. The only question is, what does the syntax look like in PHP? I think you're going to be relieved to see that it's, quote, normal syntax. So keyword while, then the expression, which needs to evaluate to true, and then a set of curly braces, and then inside of these curly braces is going to be whatever you want to happen. There could be a whole bunch of things in there. There could be one thing in there. One thing about a while loop, which is kind of a characteristic which you should consider, is it may never run. If this condition is false to start with, this chunk of code will run 0 times. I'll show you another one where it's going to run at least 1 time. That's the only reason I point that out. I use while loops pretty exclusively because they are consistent across languages. So opening curly and closing curly braces. One tip is I like to do this single line comments and say what that closing curly brace represents. Moving along, that's the general recipe. Also, those parentheses right there are optional, but you definitely probably should use them. Also, that curly brace can be on that line or the next line. I always put it on that line. Style. So again, here you see a real example. So those parentheses are optional, but I always use them, and I put my curly brace there. Some people could put their curly brace there. It's fine. So here's how this is actually going to play out. So keyword while, there's my condition, there's my curly braces. Now if you're new to loops or just they never really sunk in, there's kind of a couple things you need to take care of. One of them is a counter. So this is a special variable. It's not really special. It's actually a simple variable. It keeps track of how many times you've been through this loop of code. So I initialize it to whatever I want to initialize it to. That's going to be your starting point. It's usually 0. This inequality right here represents how many times it's going to run. This right here is going to print out the value of I, and this right here is called incrementing the counter, right? So it starts off at 0. We go into this loop. We say, is 0 less than 5? It is. So I print out 0, and I add 1 to it, so it becomes 1. And I printed out a 0 a second ago. Now I'm saying, is 1 less than 5? It is. I print out 1 and I make it a 2. And I repeat that process until I is 4. 4 is less than 5, so I print it out. 4 becomes 5. 5 is not less than 5, so I break out of the loop. As soon as this condition is false, I skip to the end of the curly brace and I move along my way. Standard loop situation. Very powerful structure, but pretty simple on its own. So, there's another kind of syntax, and so this is called a do-while loop. Notice how this is syntactically different. So keyword do up at the top, curly braces, statements, and then down after the last curly brace, keyword while, and then the expression. So notice the syntax difference is there's a semicolon there. This is what you would use if you wanted this chunk of code to run at least once, because the condition doesn't get evaluated until the bottom. This is present in all languages. Sometimes it can save you a line or two of code, but I generally solve problems with that kind of a while loop. So if you wonder what that is and why you might want to do it, well, it has its utility. It's not a completely different world. So here's a similar example to that one I showed you a little bit like a couple slides ago, but this is a do-while loop instead of a good old-fashioned while loop. So you can evaluate the condition at the top or the bottom. So I made little YouTube videos for each one of these things because that makes sense to me to have that be a learning activity. So I figured I'd point at them for you just to show you what it looks like. So here's a real example of a while loop for you. Right, it starts at 0, goes to 50. Here's the thing. I don't know how I'm going to handle this because I'm going to make a real video on it, but I just wanted to show you kind of what it looks like because I assume you may not have looked at those videos yet, or maybe you looked at them 2 days ago and you don't remember. I have a counter. I call it I started at 0, and I go to 50. So this is going to print out values from 0 to 50. Notice that or equal to makes it inclusive. Here I increment my counter, and here I print out I. If you're wondering what that /n is, that's a line break in the source code. You'll get a feel for what that means at some point. You don't need that. It doesn't do anything in terms of what it displays, but when you view the source of the actual HTML, it's going to have line breaks in it, which is going to be a lot easier to look at. All right, so I'm trying to not spend much time on those because you can spend time on them if you need to spend time on them. All right, the next stop on the tour is a for loop. So you very well might not know much about a for loop, depending on your background. So this does the same thing as a while loop. It's just more shorthand. I don't blame you if you don't like using these. I don't like using them a lot either because I write so many different languages. The little differences in the syntax kind of throw me off, whereas while loops are always the same. They are a little bit shorthand. If there's some things that seem kind of tedious about while loops, this is the attempt to clean that up for you. So keyword for, and this is kind of sort of, it's not the condition, right? It's a big chunk of stuff in the parentheses. And then curly braces and statements. The curly brace and statements, in other words, the internal components of this repetition structure, don't change at all. So we're going to call this the initialization. This is the condition. So this is the part that would be in a while loop, and this is the incrementation. So when you make a loop, it's kind of annoying that we have to create these somewhat temporary little variables outside of the loop. So we take that and we move it inside of the loop, and that's the init. This doesn't change at all. And this is the incrementation, right? Like adding 1 or subtracting 1. It's not a really useful thing to talk about, but I'll show you an example. Here's a real example. So this is a for loop. So here's my counter, right? So rather than declaring it outside of the loop, I declare it inside of those parentheses. I call it whatever I want to call it. I give it an initialization like 0. Here's the condition. So I'll say while I is less than or equal to 5. That's not any different. And here's my incrementation. I mean, you can see, so there's 2 steps which normally happen not on that line, which we're rolling into that line. And then from this point down, it's not really any different, with the exception of I'm not going to increment my counter inside the loop. Now, strangely, you could do something like that, but I know you don't want to do that. That would end up adding 2 to I, because you're adding 1 here and 1 there. So you don't want to probably do that inside of the loop. So if you like this, great. If you don't like it, well, why don't you play around with it? I think fors are one of those things that look intimidating because they are highly symbolic as opposed to a while loop. One thing I could say about it is if I put a while loop in front of someone who didn't know how to program, they could probably read it, figure out what it might do. But if I put a 4 in front of them, they probably wouldn't have any idea what it did. But it's really not that hard if you can get used to it. But then again, if you don't get used to it, it's not going to cause you any big problems. So I did a little example of a for loop, and I did a perfect square example of that. Actually, I'm not sure if I actually did that. I made a little for loop over here, but I feel like, yeah, exactly, it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. So anyways, here's a for loop, basically, right? Shorter code, kind of easier to manage. So this is a for loop. I am initializing I to 0, and I'm going up to 49. Notice it's not or equal to, so it is going to stop one short. If I wanted to go to 50, I would put an equal in there, and I'm adding 1. I said this was going to be a perfect square example. It's not a perfect square example. It's just going to spit out values from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 49. It's not much different. I mean, I guess it might be slightly more interesting if it had a perfect square in it, but I'll do a perfect square in the YouTube video. Like I said, I'm not trying to sit here. I'm trying to wick out the code examples to make these videos a little more concise. This is a new class to me. This lecture, PowerPoint lecture format is something I'm still trying to figure out. All right, so the next and last part of the tour is talking about tables. So tables are just a way to display data. It kind of looks like what you would imagine an Excel spreadsheet or a database report looks like, something like that, where you got clear cells with borders, right? There's rows, there's columns. You can do similar schemes with divs, and that's modern web development is more div heavy and less table heavy. If you could take a trip back to like the year 2000, everyone was using tables for layouts. And so the idea is that tables are not a great tool for layouts, at least that's kind of the reputation they have, and divs are more scalable. But we're not using them for layout, we're using them to display data. And if you've got a column of data, yeah, there's nothing wrong with a table. So let's talk about the syntax for a table. It's a good chance you've seen something like this before, but if you haven't, basically you've got a big old set of table tags, like opening and closing. Your table fits within those. Tables are made up of rows, right? So rows are just TR and closing TR tags. And TDs are the individual cells of the table. So looking at this example, the whole thing's the table. A TR encompasses that row, and these little cells are TD. And so those are the things you need for a table, and those are the things that I'm going to implement in my tables. However, with the advent of HTML5, they created some new tags, th,thead, tbody, tfoot. These are things that you should put in a well-polished table, but like I said, this isn't a web development class. We've got our hands full just creating functional PHP and valid things that display on the screen. These are things you would want to put in a more production site. That you can imagine they help a screen reader to interpret the contents of your table, but I oftentimes don't utilize them because what we're doing is already complicated enough. I don't think I need more HTML details in it. So those are legitimate. Those are HTML5 things. You should use them in your table, but I oftentimes won't. Let's look at a real example of a table. All right, so big old opening table tag here, closing table tag here. It doesn't need a width. That's really not something that you need to do. This is also inline styling, which is a bad idea. But in PHP, this is really not necessary, but this part right here, border equals 1, I think that's a good idea. Not because it looks good, but when you're trying to get your tables drawn, if you don't have borders on them, they're literally just invisible on the screen. And so I put that in there just as a temporary little thing to make it show up. And here's a opening TR, runs from here to here, right? There's a row, and there's a row. And notice there's a TD, and so that's that little cell right there. That's that cell right there. That's the end of the row. That's a new row, which starts here. That's a cell right there, and that's a cell right there. There's a closing TR, and there's a closing table. You can get away with murder in tables. You can forget to close tags, but the thing is, when you run it through a validator, oftentimes you'll realize the egregious mistakes that you have. So do be kind of careful, as careful as you can when you're putting together tables, because that's a tough thing to write. There's opening and closing tags everywhere. Things are inside of things. You can get away with some really crazy stuff that will probably cause huge problems at some point, but it's not apparent at first. And I'm going to make a video of an ASCII table. So ASCII table is based on the idea of ASCII values, whereas like numeric values associated with letters. So I'm going to make a video on that. it's going to be a good opportunity for me to show you what a table looks like. I'm going to spend some time this week creating some stuff on tables. So here's a table for you. Anyways, just a quick example of kind of my recipe for creating a table. And there is a recipe. So I echo out the opening table tag, then I echo out the closing table tag, and then if you're going to be spitting out a dynamic table, like it's a dynamic in that you might not necessarily know how many rows or columns it has. I guess it doesn't have to be dynamic, but it's going to have a nested loop format. So here's my outer loop, here's my inner loop. I've got two counters, I've got I and J. Now this value right here, that represents how many rows are going to be in your table. And that value there represents how many columns are going to be in your table. Now for this week's assignment, you're going to be doing a square, and that dimension is going to be a variable which you get from a form. So, right, if it was a 10 by 10 thing, that would be 10, and that would be 10. Also, this counter right here, the inner counter, if you will, does need to get reset for each new row. And so here's my inner loop. So I'm just trying to discuss this very briefly. The inner loop is responsible for shooting out the TDs, or the individual cells of the table. And the outer loop is responsible for spitting out the opening and closing row tags. So do you see right before my inner loop, I open the row. Right after the loop, I close the row. So that's the format. It might be a hard pill to swallow, but that is the recipe, right? So the inner loop is doing the TDs, the outer loop is doing the TRs. Don't forget to reset your counter for the inner loop after each iteration, and that's how it works. And the next part is just that, right? I'm not going to do that, but I do have a huge, 20-30 minute video on it, so walking you through how that's going to work. That is just a table. It's really hard for me to look at. I'm pretty sure it's hard for most people to look at, so I apologize for that. But that's going to give you the opportunity to practice writing some loops and creating a table. So I hope this helps you. There's some other content posted this week, so make sure you get to that. And I think the lab is probably the most important learning activity for the week, so have fun with that. And if you got any questions about anything, then let me know.